I am Rumpa Banerjee, Communications Associate from TERI. It is my pleasure to invite you to the virtual dialogue on lifestyles and sustainable consumption in the context of SDG 12. This policy dialogue is being organized as a part of SDG Charter under the Act for Earth initiative of TERI. Before we begin the event proceedings, we request all the speakers to turn on their cameras for a quick photo op. Thank you, everyone. I would request all the speakers to turn on their video when they speak. I have the pleasure to invite Dr. Vibhu, Director General TERI, to deliver the welcome address. The floor is yours, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and very good afternoon to all the participants. Thank you, Mr. Kant, for joining us. I'm thankful to Ms. Potter and all the panelists for the roundtable discussion. It's a great day for us, and I'm extremely delighted to welcome you all to the SDG Charter Virtual Policy Dialogue on Lifestyles and Sustainable Consumption in the context of SDG 12. SDG Charter, as you all know, is a component under Act for Earth that was launched during the valedictory session of TERI's flagship program, World Sustainable Development Summit. We held this particular conference every year in the month of February, and are looking forward to participation of all of you in the next session, which will be from 24th to 26th of Feb 23. Now, the idea of lifestyles for the environment, life movement, was introduced by our Honorable Prime Minister, Shri Narendra Modi ji, during the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP26 in Glasgow last year. The idea promotes an environment-conscious lifestyles that focuses on mindful and deliberate utilization instead of mindless and destructive consumption by advocating sustainable choices by pro-planet people. At 1.9 tons, India's per capita emissions, which are less than half the world average and perhaps lowest among the G20 countries. But looking at the size of the population, I think we need to take immediate actions. Till now, I'll say we are not the part of the problem, but definitely we can be part of the solution. And in doing so, we really need to address the issues related to climate change. Per capita and equity consideration, they will be key to equitable consumption space. Despite the basic principles that demand is a key driver of supply, there exist significant gaps in data at the individual consumer level, including a global indicator framework. This gap must be urgently addressed. As we all are aware, India is due to assume G20 presidency later this year. And in this context of life, India can take a leadership role and launch a global coalition on lifestyles for environment and a global coalition of responsible advertisement. Who better to drive this agenda than Shri Amitabh Kant, who is credited with so many communication campaigns and policy initiatives in the country. I'm very pleased to introduce Shri Amitabh Kant, who is presently G20 Sherpa, ex-CEO Niti Aayog, author of Incredible India, Branding India and Transforming Ideas for India, and so many. I should say that if I start speaking, we will have no time left for even having the panel discussion. There's so much to spread it. With these words, I would like to invite Shri Amitabh Kant to deliver the keynote address. The floor is yours, sir.
Dr. Vibhu, Thank you so much for that introduction and for your kind words. I'm truly delighted to be participating in this session on enabling sustainable lifestyle. Uh, uh, this is a unique launch of the policy brief on enabling sustainable lifestyles in a climate emergency by the United Nations Environment Programme. Today, one of the biggest challenges around us undeniably is the threat posed by climate change. The latest report of the UNFCCC, in the words of the UN Secretary General, is a code red for humanity. Therefore, this launch comes at a time when the threat posed by unmitigated climate change is more real and palpable than ever before. Climate change has become an extremely important point of focus for countries across the world. We all must understand that how we act today will have a huge impact on the future of our world, which we all have a collective responsibility towards. The key is climate consciousness, climate justice, and climate action. We are all living through times of a global pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic taught us a very critical lesson to all of us, that despite our incredible scientific and technological prowess, we remain at the mercy of the natural world. The throwaway culture that exists and consumerism further worsens the climate change. The transition to a circular economy from today's take, make, use, dispose economy is the need of the hour. India has always displayed strong climate leadership. The UN emissions gap report outlines that India is the only G20 country whose nationally determined contribution were compliant to COP21. We have built a globally competitive renewable energy industry. We are world-class clean energy players with top-notch execution capability. At the COP26, the Honorable Prime Minister made a very, very strong commitment towards climate action through the Panchamrit formula. He said that India has demonstrated true climate leadership and our commitment towards reducing emissions are supported by concrete action. These include cutting India's total projected carbon emission by 1 billion ton by 2030, reducing the carbon intensity of the nation's economy by less than 45% by the end of the decade, and net zero carbon emissions by 2070. The Prime Minister had underscored the need for the world to come together and take lifestyle for environment forward as a mass movement of environmental conscious lifestyle. We cannot reduce the carbon footprint without fundamentally changing how we behave as individuals and the activities that we undertake on a daily basis. The Prime Minister had emphasized individual behavioral change because from COP1 to COP26, the countries have not been able to fulfill their targets. We will go on talking about 2050, but in 2049, you will find countries not achieving their targets unless and until there's a fundamental behavioral change by individuals. And that is what the Prime Minister was talking about when he said that lifestyle for behavioral change, lifestyle as sustainable life, and turning it into a mass movement for environmental conscious lifestyle. If you look at the many countries, their lifestyles are based on wastage of resources, particularly the developed world. Excessive use of personal vehicles, lights remaining switched on all night, and wastage of water are many, many such examples. In India, we have a way of life which has always promoted and has some respect for the environment and nature. The average carbon footprint per person in India is 0.56 tons per year, which is significantly lower than the global average of 4 tons. Therefore, there are a lot of lessons to be learned from the lives of Indian citizens. Indians have ingrained social norms and belief systems which have a direct positive impact on their carbon footprint. This is applicable across household level activities such as food consumption patterns, transport user choices, and energy and water management. And therefore, it's important that as India urbanizes in the years to come, we do the right urbanization. We train people and their behaviors for food consumption patterns, which will promote life, and we push for transport usage, which is mass-based, which is public-based, and not for individual cars, so that carbon footprints can be reduced radically. Therefore, this is a challenge not just limited to households. With a long history of functioning in resource-constrained environments, agrarian societies in India have adapted themselves as well. This is reflected in irrigation and farming practices, such as the construction of traditional water bodies to cope with the water-related stress in the widespread practice of planting neem, banyan, and peepal trees alongside built structures. As stated by the Prime Minister, India's relationship with its environment has been one of mindful and deliberate utilization. There's a need to study this relationship in greater depth and identify ways of leveraging the existing social norms for creating meaningful behavior change amongst individuals. Life or lifestyle for environment is India's contribution to the global climate crisis. Through the Life campaign launched by the Prime Minister, we are aiming to encourage people to recognize the significant impact of the seemingly small actions on climate change. And that is why we've invited ideas from universities, from think tanks across the world, so that those ideas can be then taken forward for implementation on ground. In his address to the World Economic Forum, the Prime Minister had introduced the idea of P3, Pro-Planet People movement, that underlines India's climate change commitments in the global forum. The time is right now to mobilize action and make the Life campaign into a pro-planet people mass movement, similar to what we had done earlier with the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, the Clean India Mission, wherein a concerted and sustained effort by individuals, households, and communities became the key driver of ramping up sanitation coverage across the country in a relatively short period of time. Our philosophy is that climate change must now become a movement of the masses. We cannot combat climate change without the participation of people. We also must actively think of ways in which we nudge citizens towards climate-friendly practice. To translate the Prime Minister's vision of life into reality, it is vital to explore novel approaches that can nudge climate-positive behavior in individuals. Individual action, in turn, can unleash a mass movement by encouraging and inspiring other members of the society. We are very glad that all of you are working with the UN on taking this vision forward. I am certain that your policy brief would offer useful insight and propose impactful interventions which can help governments and businesses kickstart the transition to sustainable lifestyle. We look forward to continued collaboration on this adaptation of sustainable lifestyles for countering climate change. We must now turn this into a global movement, and through this policy brief, we are taking the much welcome first step. We would fully support this, and during the G20 movement, India would be the first one to take this forward. My best wishes, once again, my compliments to TERI and to Dr. Vibhu Dhawan and the entire team. Thank you very much, and we are here to fully support you in this endeavor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I can assure you we'll try our level best, whatever little we can do. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Now I invite Dr. Shelly Kedia, Senior Fellow at the Center for Sustainable Development Research and Leadership, TERI, to give the presentation on the findings of TERI study. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Rumpa. I will be sharing my screen. Can you please confirm if you can see the screen? Okay. Greetings to all of you. I am pleased to present to all of you the framing presentation, which is based on a study on the topic of lifestyles and sustainable consumption in the context of SDG 12. We'll bring this study out in the form of a policy brief, and we hope to launch it at the COP27 at Sharm el-Sheikh this year. First of all, we'd like to thank our partners for support to the World Sustainable Development Summit and to the Act for Earth initiative. On behalf of the TERI team, we acknowledge Bloomberg Philanthropies, the Rockefeller Foundation, BMUV, IKI, and Tata Cleantech Capital. I would like to acknowledge the study team as listed on this slide, including our advisor, Dr. Pradipta Ghosh, who will be moderating the panel discussion, as well as the reviewer, Dr. Sunil Pandey. I'd also like to thank the TERI leadership, including Dr. Vibhu, for giving us strong support on this particular initiative. This study, as well as this dialogue, are part of the SDG Charter, which is a component under the Act for Earth initiative that was launched at the valedictory session of the World Sustainable Development Summit 2022 that concluded in February this year. The study aims to contributing to framing of lifestyles and sustainable consumption and implications for policy instruments, market instruments, as well as social instruments. The scope of the study is limited to G20 countries. The rationale behind the study is also based on the fact that mainstream frameworks focus more on upstream and midstream components that limit to the extraction, production, and manufacturing segments, but not so much on the individual consumer. Now, when we talk about unsustainable lifestyle, what is the picture that has emerged as a result of unsustainable consumption and lifestyles? On the slide here, you see the Anthropocene chicken, which is basically the broiler chicken, which over the years, humans and mass production of meat resulted in quadrupling the size of a chicken. So we've also massively modified species, when we talk about lifestyles, and just because humans like to eat more chicken, and that is how we've even modified species to suit our lifestyles as well as needs. Another image that comes to the mind is the Anthropocene novel entities, which is one of the planetary boundaries, and it is putting more and more pressure in terms of straining the ecosystem integrity. When we talk about sustainable lifestyles and consumption, the issue of underconsumption must also be addressed. Developing countries, including India, are on the path to development and will need to have their fair share of the carbon space as well as resources. Here on this slide, you see the cumulative CO2 emissions for G20 countries from 1850 to 2020. What we see is, this is only for G20 countries and the EU. We see the US has the highest share and Argentina has the lowest share. And most of the other developing countries are also in the bottom. When we talk about per capita emissions, we see that amongst the G20 countries and the EU, India has the lowest share and Saudi Arabia has the highest share. This is in per capita terms. Now, when we talk about policy relevance of lifestyles and sustainable consumption, this has been on the global agenda since the Agenda 21 at the Rio Summit of 1992. In 2015, the aspect of sustainable or responsible consumption and production also finds mention is in SDG 12. And as was also flagged by a keynote speaker, the lifestyle for environment or life movement was also it has also been a focus of the updated NDCs as well as the announcement by the Prime Minister of India at COP26. So how do we define sustainable lifestyles? For this study, we chose the working definition of individual choices and attitude towards consumption of goods and services to further human well-being while minimizing ecological footprint and waste to promote intragenerational and intergenerational equity for sustainable development. What are the related concepts of lifestyle and sustainable consumption? Underconsumption, equitable consumption, fair consumption. Our colleague from UNEP will also be talking more about fair consumption when he gives the intervention. And when we talk about lifestyles in the context of resources, we look at resource value chains, which starts from resource extraction to the disposal phase. When we talk about sustainable lifestyles, we talk more about the use by the consumer or the retail consumer and the disposal phase, but not to say, as flagged by Dr. Dhawan, demand does drive supply. So the choices which individuals have as a collective can also influence the upstream segment of resource value chains. Now, how do we frame sustainable lifestyles and sustainable consumptions? When we talk about choices, by whom? How do we see the individual? Do we see them as people, as government wants to see them, as political constituents, as consumer, as markets want to see them, or as humans, which who are embedded within the planet Earth and which has its limitations in terms of carrying capacity, in terms of the planetary boundaries. The question of choice of consumption of good and the quantities typically in economies are determined by the level of income and is framed in economics and as a matter of consumer sovereignty. However, this sovereignty, depending on the social and policy objectives, can be trumped over. For example, intoxicants can be banned, vaccinations can be made mandatory, as well as individuals may be taxed or given subsidies. Another aspect is that advertisement, when it comes to choices, advertisement is a very powerful tool to influence consumer choices. So now to understand the picture for G20 countries, TERI developed a lifestyle and consumption index for G20. In this is an aggregate index based on 4 sectors: food, transport, residential, and waste management. For food, we use meat and dairy production in tons per capita. All the units were in tons per capita. That's how we use, we standardized it. For transport, we use the total final energy consumption in the transport sector. In residential, again, the energy consumption in the residential sector. And for waste management, plastic waste generation in tons per capita. And the choice of these index is based on literature as well as the availability. It is also constrained by the data availability. Because a lot of these indicators really are not reported at the end consumer level, but at an aggregate economy level. But however, given the data constraints, we had to go with these indicators, and the normalization process was based on preparing an index and then later on aggregating it. So what is the score? We see that in terms of lifestyle and sustainable consumption, India has the highest score, meaning in terms of the fact that it has the lowest consumption so far, which is expected to rise, followed by Indonesia. And the US has the lowest score, meaning that it has the highest consumption in these 4 sectors. Of course, these results are not surprising because, this is, kind of a matter of the fact that, the first point that was made, that it is usually in the fact that lifestyles are determined by the, economic level and income levels of countries. Coming to instruments. So when it comes to transport, what we see in G20 countries that emissions and fuel efficiency standards are the most widely used policy instrument. In some countries, there's also taxation on fuel and high fuel emission vehicles along with registration. And there is now lately a lot of investment in public infrastructure, including for public transport, but also for electric vehicles, where there is a lot of scope for diversifying the types of instrument. It is provision for eco-mobility by private players, company logistics and contracts, as well as consumer rewards schemes, as well as social, instruments such as campaigns, advertisement, and public awareness. When we talk about instruments in the food sector, again, the most dominant, instrument is related to food safety standards and to some extent labeling. However, this is not prevalent across all G20 countries, and this is an area, which needs further sort of strengthening. In terms of waste, what we see is that this is an emerging area. Apart from advertising and campaigns, there is some initiative related to take back, buyback schemes, as well as labeling and certification schemes, in terms of waste management. So again, here, there is a lot of scope for diversifying or for introducing new types of instruments. In residential sector, what we see is that on the appliance side, there is significant development across G20 countries. Also, to some extent, utility demand side management, labeling, certification, green building, building codes. Also, in some cases, participation in energy efficient certification schemes, and again, like in some cases, also billing disclosure programs. But again, these can be strengthened further. Now, guiding questions, which also be posed as a question for the panelists. What metrics can be used for measuring lifestyles and sustainable consumption? How can present indicator frameworks on SDG 12 be strengthened? So what we feel is SDG 12 indicators can have more downstream related indicators, especially when it concerns the retail consumer and related instruments such as eco labels. Right now, within the existing indicator framework, this is not being monitored, and this is again at the normative level also. G20 can take a larger leadership role. Data gaps need to be addressed because, at least in the public domain, while we know that certain marketing advertisement industries, in terms of market research, do collect consumer data, this is not something that is available in the public domain to guide decision making processes. So again, this data gap needs to be addressed. And what are the implications in terms of role of governments and policy instruments for various sectors? So there is a need for deployment of all types of instruments, right, ranging from command and control to voluntary. But also the fact that at the subnational level there needs to be a greater nudge at the subnational level, but also across governance levels. How can markets play a driving role in promoting sustainable lifestyles? Here we feel the role of responsible advertising is key, and this is a segment which remains to be done. Now, what are the implications for India's leadership in making lifestyles and sustainable consumption a focus area for G20 countries? Here, of course, India can take a normative leadership to nudge countries to adopt a variety of instruments for sustainable lifestyles. And this could, include the constitution of a G20 working group on the topic, launching a coalition on sustainable lifestyle for G20, or launching a coalition for responsible advertising at the G20. So these are just some of the points that we want to leave you with, in terms of the preliminary findings of the study. And with this, I'd like to stop sharing my screen and hand over the screen back to Rumpa. Over to you, Rumpa.
Thank you, ma'am. Now we move to the segment of policy perspective by Ms. Cheshta Kocher, Senior Advisor, Behavioral Insights Unit, Niti Aayog. Over to you, ma'am.
Thanks, Shelly, and thank you, Dr. Dhawan, for having me here with you. I want to first just capture a little bit more detail on life as a program and some key guiding principles with which this program has been conceived so that it informs our thinking as we are thinking further on the policy brief as well. So at the heart of it, like Kant sir also highlighted, it is a recognition of the power of individual action in the climate debate. To give some numbers which has inspired this recognition is and it's a UNEP number, is to say if 1/8 of the population adopted climate friendly behaviors, about 20% of our global carbon emissions can reduce. To make it more relatable to India, if only 50% of our driving population carpool, then we would save about 7.8 lakh rides in a day in India, which will save us about 380 million liters of fuel in a day. That is the power of individual action, which life is trying to capture. This recognition is, of course, like Shelly also highlighted, is reflecting in our updated NDCs, which we have submitted as of August 2022, which is to say, it is now our commitment to the world to not only talk about climate action, but walk the talk and demonstrate how individual action can complement the policy initiatives and not a standalone solution that we are claiming for climate action. Couple of things about life is, one is that it's an India-led program, but it's a global program. And why that is important to keep in mind is which is to say we are the first movers. And that's important because when 17% of the world's population changes its way of living, that is changing social norms altogether, which is a very important concept as we are looking at behavior change as to how do we change the social norms surrounding sustainable consumption and production, and not just individual patterns. So when the dominant section of the world population changes their behaviors, it affects social norms, and then that's an important recognition for us as first movers. Second important recognition for us as both the upcoming G20 presidency, but also as the first mover of life, is that we have to demonstrate success. Like Shelley also highlighted, we are one of the lowest carbon emitters, per capita carbon emitters in the world. Our per capita carbon emission is 1.2 tons per year per capita. The world global average is 4 tons. So we are one of the lowest. And despite that, we want to demonstrate even then we can do better. So there is so much scope for the rest of the world, especially the developed world, to take action and cover the delta. Third, and the most important, and I think most relevant for this discussion, is that since it's a global program in which India is a first mover, it needs to be a replicable and a scalable program, which means that it needs to be a measurable program. And that is, I think, some of the questions that Shelley also left us with, as to what is the theory of change behind this program, how are we measuring it, and what is some science that we want to introduce. Some of the answers we have, and then some of them are open questions where scholars like you can give important inputs. But before that is also why does India have the competitive advantage, or what are some of the competitive advantages that we want to keep in mind as we develop this program that India has? One is that we have success with global Jan Andolans or mass Jan Andolans in history. Swachh Bharat mission has been globally acclaimed. There is the Give It Up campaign, which reached about 10 million people and saved us about $50 billion to the exchequer through a mass movement. So we have experience, and we want to look back at that and say what worked and what didn't, and what is the pattern that we learned. Second is we are a country of young technology entrepreneurs. Like the scholars, like the speakers previous to me have highlighted, changing individual demand will rest on it being supported from the supply, and it's difficult to move traditional industry. But we are not dominantly occupied by traditional industry. We are dominantly occupied by entrepreneurs who are agile, who shift more quickly to market demand, and therefore it is in our interest to change the market demand. And then third is we are global influencers. What Kansar was highlighting on 5th June when the Honorable Prime Minister launched the global movement live, Ms. Inger Anderson was present, and in her words, and I quote, "When India leans in, the world watches and follows." So we are global influencers, not just in terms of the size of our population, but also in the innovations we've been displaying in our policy action, in our individual action, in our industrial action. So these are some of our competitive strengths to be the first movers in life. And keeping that in mind, we are designing a model in which, and this is where I want to deviate from the general understanding of life, that the first component or the first initiating component of life is changing behaviors. It is not the final component. Because when individual demand changes, and this is the theory of change we are working with, is to say it signals the markets to respond to that change in demand. Because we are an entrepreneur dominant market, that signaling and that response is likely to be quicker than regions which are more dominated by traditional industry. So when individual demands change, it sends a signal to markets. When markets change, they further enable individual action to change. So we are taking the first step as changing individual demand, but by no stretch of imagination are we thinking that in itself is a sufficient thing to do. Where policy comes in is that we need policy to trigger individual action. And I will come to that in terms of what kind of policy and how can people like us play a role. And similarly, we need policy to enable the markets to respond to this change more swiftly, which is by giving incentives, by enabling investments, by incentivizing employment in the green industry, so that the market is able to respond to the change in demand more swiftly. But what we can do, which is the first component and perhaps the most important component of life, which is changing demand, is some limited And some traditional ways of changing is something we've already highlighted through campaigns, through mass movements, through advertisements, which are known ways as to how to change behavior. But there are also other ways that we are looking to exploring, which is how do you integrate life principles in your existing programs, which is if you're granting, let's say, an award or a grant to a project in city development, how are you ensuring that that project is not furthering unsustainable lifestyles? Otherwise, the entire objective of life is moot if we are continuing in parallel in supporting projects that are feeding into unsustainable lifestyles. Similarly, we want to see what is it that your own institutions can do? And institutions is a big chunk in demand, which is, can you implement life within your institutions? Can the 50 employees of your institution become pro-planet people? Can the 11 million employees of the government of India become pro-planet people to begin with? So citizens, like Shelley was highlighting, who are the people whose demands we have to change? We are understanding it at 3 levels. One is individual demand, one person in toto. One is community demand, which are influenced more by social norms that we're changing. And then third is institutional demand. Those institutional demand is both market and government, as well as independent organizations like yours and mine. So that is where the government can play in. The role that academia specifically and scholars can specifically play in, is what Amitabh sir was also highlighting, and what the Prime Minister has launched is the global call for ideas and papers. But in specifically, and to some of the questions that Shelley also pointed, is helping the movement understand what are the behaviors we must focus on to begin with, or what are the initial behaviors to focus on, which are not only easy to change, and or are less sticky, but also which have the most impact on climate indicators, which have the greatest attributable impact to climate indicators. What are those behaviors? We need scientists to focus on it. Most of the scholarly community has focused on these questions in the Western context. We need the scholarly community to focus on this, including in the South context, in the global South context. Second, like Shelley highlighted, is and these behaviors, before I go to the second point, these behaviors are both adaptation and mitigation behaviors. So far, whenever we're talking about behavior change in climate action, we have been focusing on mitigation behaviors. How do we change things differently? But we are not yet talking about adaptation behaviors in behavior change. The scholarly community needs to step in to tell us what are those adaptation behaviors that individuals, communities, and institutions can adopt, can practice, and what is the projected impact on the climate indicators? There's no science as of now, there's limited science on this subject. Second is, how do we measure? There is plenty science now on how do we measure behaviors, but the causality or the attributable impact of these behaviors on climate indicators needs behavior scientists and climate scientists to work together to say, this is how we're going to measure behaviors, but this is the causal impact that we can attribute to this change in behavior to these key climate indicators. We need science on that to step in. And then third, and most importantly, like I'm saying, it's an India-led program, but it's a global program, which is where we also need science to say some of the solutions we are deploying in India, both behavior change solutions, nudges, market solutions, policy solutions, how do we scale those solutions? The impact of life, what Honorable Prime Minister has been repeatedly saying, is when 1 billion people take one step, that's when it's 1 billion steps towards climate change and towards climate action. It's not one step at a time. It's not incremental. So if we are thinking, let's India change it, and then US will change, and then Europe will change, that is not the approach that life is built on. It is not incremental. It is when the world will change behaviors, that is when it'll move the needle on climate indicators. So we want to understand, and we want the best minds of India and the world to tell us, how are we going to scale these solutions, given that behavior change solutions are so context dependent? How are we going to change? How are we going to scale these solutions? So these are, if for lack of a better word, these are my asks of the global community and the scholar community sitting here as you're going to proceed into the panel discussion, which is to say, help us understand. And through this discussion, through the policy briefs, but also through the global call for ideas and papers, and independently reach out to the life team, is to say, what are the behaviors we need to focus on? Why are those the behaviors? What is the projected impact of those behaviors on climate indicators? How are we going to measure the impact from both existing data sets as well as new methodologies if needed? And then how are we going to scale those solutions? That is where we need science to come in. One of the big things of life that we want to introduce, impacts of life in addition to climate change, is that we need data sets now on human behavior. We do not have large scale data sets on human behavior. And therefore, we are not yet able to, in a scientific manner, attribute change in development indicators to some of the behavior change that we are causing at mass. And India has a unique opportunity to do it because we have led Jan Andolans. We have led world's largest Jan Andolans, such as Swachh Bharat, Give It Up campaign, Ujjwala scheme, Ujala scheme. These are massive, massive campaigns. But one of the limitations of these campaigns may be the scalability, because we have not been able to capture the data. We have captured data in silos. We have captured data on behavior change on one hand, and then we have captured data on the related development indicators on the other hand. We don't have large scale data sets which say what can be attributable impact of some of the surrounding social norms, of some of the behaviors, measurable behaviors on the development indicators that we are chasing as a world, not just as a country, as SDG goals. What are some of the measurable behaviors that speak to the SDG goals? The UN representatives are there. I also want to submit to them. We have 169 indicators across 17 priority sectors of SDGs. How many of those are behavioral indicators? Right. So we want to capture that. What are the behaviors, institutional behaviors, individual behaviors, community behaviors that feed into SDG goals, that feed into some of the development goals that we're chasing as a global community? That is the power, and that is the scientific power that the group on this discussion can bring to the table with life. I will stop there and let you proceed on the conversation. But thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure talking to all of you. Over to you, Shelley.
Thank you, ma'am. We will now move forward with the roundtable discussion with sector experts moderated by Dr. Pradipta Ghosh, Distinguished Fellow TERI and former Secretary, Ministry of Environment, India. I request Dr. Ghosh to take over the discussions from here.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And we are now in the roundtable discussion, which will last 75 minutes. And we have 6 very highly experienced and distinguished speakers in this roundtable discussion. I do not know if it is technically possible in this format for any Q&A, but I would encourage the participants to put their questions in the chat box so that the speakers may see those questions and respond to them. But let me begin with some thoughts of my own. The life agenda has been conceptualized in the context of climate change. And indeed, the question of sustainable consumption and production has been a hoary perennial in the climate change discussions for decades, right since the very beginning of the climate change debates and the negotiating process. But it has not made much headway, although everybody recognizes that the key to global sustainability lies through sustainable consumption and production. But however, sustainability, we can also think of it in a broader context than just climate change, and I will come to that in a minute. But let me give one quick input to what Shelley presented, and that's the question of development of indexes of sustainable consumption. And here I think we need to keep in mind 2 things. One is that it is all right to have an aggregated index, but we lose a lot of information. So while we develop an index, we also need to preserve the granular information so that in terms of different yardsticks and indicators, say food choices, say transportation choices, say space heating choices or space cooling choices, then we are able to understand how each country is placed, and then countries can, sort of take it upon themselves to improve their ranking on the individual indicators. The second input that I would like to give is that each index must be in intensive terms. For example, what do I mean by that? Which means that it isn't enough to say that citizens in country A consume on average twice as many calories than citizens in country B. What we need to know is that, however, and whatever the citizens of each country eat, and there are wide differences in food choices, what is the GHG or other indicators, which I will come to, implicated per kilocalorie of the food intake. We can do this also for example, transportation. It doesn't matter if the average European or American travels 10 times as much as an average Indian in the course of the year. What matters is that per passenger kilometer of travel, what is the GHGs or other indexes, involved in the transportation. So that is one comment that I would have to make. Now, I would like to just talk about extending the domain of life beyond simply the climate change dimension. And Cheshka has already talked about extending the domain of life not to beyond mitigation, where it has traditionally resided, to also look at adaptation, choices and adaptation, adaptation behaviors. And I think, for example, per capita water use is one possible indicator of the question of addressing the adaptation dimension. But here I would like to bring in some other dimensions of what would be sustainable, not in a narrow climate change sense, but in a wider normative, moral sense of what it means to be sustainable. So let me give some examples. So one is, of course, say the animal rights dimension. And here this question of animal rights has been relegated to, policies of individual countries. No global norms exist. So animals are, reared in cages, in mass production. They live in circumstances which would severely, impact one's moral sense. So can we think of indicators that in respect of one's choices of, say, food, that what is the percentage of calories of total food consumption derived from animals, which are reared in conditions, which may be defined as not as affronting one's sense of humanity. Another example is the question of healthy lifestyles. So, of one's consumption choices, what are the percentage of calories from unhealthy food choices, for example, say saturated fats, sugar, intoxicants, and so on? Or again, staying within the domain of healthy lifestyles, what is the percentage of commuter travel by walking, cycling, and so on? Now, these are also consistent, and and maybe they have strong correlations also with the GHG intensity of this consumption. But I think that we can consider that these are also independent criteria in and of themselves. Now, when it comes also to calculating, say the the sustainability involved in production, we need to conduct not merely a first level analysis, but we need to conduct a full chain analysis. So if you are looking at what are the GHG emissions or water use involved, in food production, we need to consider
the energy consumption also in the irrigation water, in sourcing the irrigation water, in the in the fertilizer production, in the pesticide production, and so on. So undertaking a full chain analysis that will reveal actually, give a great deal of insight into what is the actual GHGs or the water stress involved. Another aspect is that when we have talked a lot about recycling and reuse, but we have ignored the dimension of what happens when it's released to the environment. So can we develop some kind of an index about the lifetime of waste with a certain toxicity, how long it lasts? Something like a toxicity times residence years in the environment. So we need to understand that also, as to how our wastes, some wastes are benign, some wastes are not so benign, some wastes are hugely damaging to the environment. So we need to also understand the the toxicity and the impacts on the environment of our waste. So now, having made these initial comments, let me start with the participants. Given the time available, so each speaker would speak for about 7 minutes, and then that would enable us to keep to our time allotted. And so I would call upon the first speaker, Dr. Jorge Laguna Celis. I hope I have not severely mangled your name. If I have done so, then my sincere apologies. Dr. Celis is the director of the One Planet Network of the UNEP. So, Dr. Celis, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ghosh. And first of all, you did not pronounce bad my name. It's absolutely wonderful. Second, I'm not a doctor. I just have a master's degree. So Mr. Laguna will do. I am absolutely delighted to be today in this virtual roundtable on lifestyles and sustainable consumption in the context of SDG 12. Particularly in this pivotal moment, as we heard in this morning's first presentation, the message that Dr. Kant gave, that incredible India can help lead the way. I am extremely fascinated by two messages that I heard in this regard. The first key message, it is that India can use and will use its leadership to bend the curve, as a matter of fact, globally, in ensuring that we see a systemic shift towards sustainable consumption and production patterns by using its leadership in the G20 agenda. This is critical. The second message that we are hearing that is critical is that also from a national standpoint, and our wonderful colleague Ms. Kokar mentioned as she spoke about the LIFE campaign, India is taking foresight interventions to ensure that at its national level, the norms, the values, the Indian way of life of frugality is, as a matter of fact, retained as the country develops, as inequalities closes, as consumption levels go higher. We represent the One Planet Network, which it is hosted and supported by the United Nations Environment Programme, but we go beyond one single organization. We bring together over 6 global coalitions that address both sectoral components of the sustainable consumption agenda, the food systems that are required to be transformed, the built environment that provides us shelter, and number 3, also very importantly, when we think about travel, when we think about leisure, sustainable tourism. Our anchor and our core remains extremely attached also to those enabling environments and these enabling conditions that are guiding our patterns of consumption and production. The way government purchases, sustainable procurement, the way consumers inform themselves before making a consumption decision, consumer information, the way, as a matter of fact, we think of our lifestyles and we educate. And I have been extremely encouraged also today here that for a very important message that I have heard in different contexts and in different ways and with different data, we need to change the way we think on sustainable consumption and production. Why do I mean this? Because there is this persistent, I would say, amalgamation that consumption or wasteful consumption is a direct correlation of income levels. We don't believe in that. We actually think that we can strive for more sustainable, circular consumption patterns, right? And more sustainable lifestyles as we raise global incomes, as we achieve the sustainable development goals, as we close inequalities. So the first goal that we praise of the Indian presidency incoming of the G20 and the vision of Prime Minister Modi is to change the way we think sustainable consumption and production. This is not an agenda of the South, this is a global agenda. The second is changing the way we act on sustainable consumption and production. And this is where I will just bring three elements in which we can support the LIFE campaign and we can support the ambitions of the G20 presidency that will be inaugurated at the end of this year. The first one is to call upon member states to demonstrate leadership and commitment to implement sustainable consumption and production. As Dr. Ghosh, you have mentioned, this goes beyond implementation of the climate agreements. It cuts to the heart of the nature and biodiversity agenda. It cuts to the heart of the pollution agenda. So looking at sustainable lifestyles and SCP as being the indispensable requirement, but also as a way of implementing climate, biodiversity, and nature goals. The second one, and in this regard, let me just stop on indicators. We want to improve indicators. We want to create indexes. We want to create data sets, and we have the largest repository of information globally to help develop those indicators. But we also have to ensure that we leave no one behind. As I speak today, over 100 member states are not in the position to report regularly on the targets and indicators of SDG 12, especially those that measure behaviors, as our distinguished colleague from NITI Aayog mentioned. We can use the influence and the impact of the G20 campaign to help countries harness data, close the digital and the data gap, and ensure that countries, particularly developing countries, are equipped with the means and ways to report on their commitments, but to harness the information to develop policies that.
Dr. Celis, I think your sound is gone off.
So we can't hear you.
The first one, it is our food systems. There are actions that can be taken by governments. There are actions that can be taken by enterprises. There are actions that can be taken by individuals. The second one, it is the built environment. And we believe that there are a number of opportunities there to impact the infrastructure, to impact the resource efficiency agendas. Last but not least, and this is where I conclude, we need to create a global movement. And this is where the LIFE campaign becomes critical. Norms, institutions will not change if we don't create the necessary critical mass. There is a need to, as a matter of fact, create a global campaign that can be supported by all relevant actors at country level, but also at global level, that will help promote this understanding by which stakeholders, including member states, public, private sector, NGOs, youth, increasingly engage in sustainable consumption and production and are able to measure their commitments, are able to create transparency, are able and empowered to create accountability. So I'll stop in this regard saying that we are pleased to be part of this effort. We are pleased to support the ambitions of the LIFE campaign, and we look forward to strengthening the leadership of India at the global level in a manner that is inclusive, that looks at the Sustainable Development Goals as an opportunity to advance a global development agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Celis, for your very comprehensive and informative presentation. And particularly, I think the point that you made about increasing per capita incomes does not have to translate into increasing unsustainability of consumption. That is, I think, spot on, and that is something which I believe the Indian presidency will certainly, like to focus on. I think you have also mentioned that UNEP hosts a very large database on on indicators of sustainable consumption. I think this will be of great interest to our researchers and to researchers in this area all over the world. So thank you very much indeed, Mr. Celis. So our next speaker is Mr. Subhashish De. He is director of the Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation. So Mr. Subhashish, you have the floor. So kindly keep your remarks within 7 to 8 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank TERI and other organizers for having me in this important seminar of today. India, along with other countries, had signed the declaration on 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which also comprises the 17 Sustainable Development Goals in September 2021. And last year, India has proposed the lifestyle for environment and it's also included in the national commitment and plan, and places life as an important discussion point in India's G20 presidency. SDG 12, the sustainable consumption and production, has emerged as an important part of the SDGs. SDG 12 can only be achieved when every country makes sure that their production and consumption patterns are not undermining the environmental boundaries of the planet and simultaneously keeping the mind of social and economic impact. Indians, since ancient time, believe in resource preservation and need-based consumption. We are suitably placed to build capacity of global north on lifestyle for environment. Beside our Indian core values of consumption in moderation, the knowledge also comes from the 700 odd scheduled tribes or Adivasis. They possess a vast repository of traditional knowledge on account of their distinctive culture and lifestyle. This knowledge, if systematically promoted or upscaled at a national level and maybe at an international level, holds tremendous potential to tackle the effect of climate change through a sustainable approach. I myself come from the northeastern part of the country, and we'll start with few examples on sustainable consumption and living from the northeast. The people of the northeastern part, as we might be aware, are non-vegetarians. So we, even the tribals, eat a lot of animals, aquatic animals, and but they do that in a very considerate and scientific manner. Many of these animals are not eaten during the periods when they hatch eggs, with the pure anthropocentric motive of conservation. As far as agriculture is concerned, I'll give you the example of the Zebo farming system of Nagaland. Is an integrated farming system for water and soil conservation with the combination of crop, livestock, and fisheries. You might also remember that rearing of pig is very common in the Northeast, but most of the pigs devour on agricultural waste and they don't burn it away just randomly. As far as water conservation is concerned, the long-standing practice of bamboo dripping in Meghalaya, where spring water is diverted to a lower part of the hill using bamboo, has been the same concept which we use in today's micro drip irrigation. There are many such examples like the sacred groves in the forest. These groves are basically trees which are considered as religiously important and are communally protected forest. This presence of the sacred groves serves several advantages as So carbon sequestration, nutrient cycle, topsoil preservation, and biodiversity conservation at no extra cost incurred. Down south in Kerala, the traditional farming technique practiced by Kuttanan region of Kerala incorporates uses of bund made of organic material for farming below sea level. And this has been declared as a globally important agricultural heritage system by the Food and Agricultural Organization. Up north in Himachal, the traditional adaptive agricultural practice such as crop diversification, mixed farming, help indigenous people in the Panji Valley in Himachal Pradesh to combat the effect of climate change. Multi-cropping had been used by various tribal communities in Odisha. Almost all tribal communities, again in Odisha, observe various forms of social sanction related to undertake or not undertake certain forest-related activities, eating or not eating certain products, when and how to eat forest produce, and performance of rituals on a community basis before the first intakes of forest-based food products. The examples are so much that it's very difficult to combine everything in this 7 minutes space. So when we talk about behavioral change, and we know that the behavioral change is required, it's a lot of behavioral change which we need to do with the urban class within the country, and maybe in various global community, not so much among the rural community, because and rural community and the forest-based community, because they had known historically to live with nature, in sync with nature, in a way that they do not harm environment critically. This historical knowledge, or this traditional knowledge, which has been, which we as Indians are losing out gradually, may be brought back by various behavioral interventions and insights. I come from civil society background, and the challenge comes to our mind, or the point comes to my mind, that what civil society can do as a community. As accelerated climate change is becoming reality, the time is not in our side. Hence, the civil society community has to create a global momentum, driving maybe by the global south, to build the effective global narrative on life as well as on SDG 12. Most importantly, on the part of the consumption. We can use platforms like UNFCCC SCOP, G20, WTO, and other global platforms to propagate this message. Here I see SDG 12 as a very sweet spot of technology, economics, and behavioral science. And in all likelihood that sustainable consumption may not going to have a adverse impact on the economic drivers, because most often than not, it is thought of that if you consume sustainably, then the economic actors are going to get impacted. In all likelihood, or in all reality, it's not the case, because otherwise we move into a condition where we have those drastic events like we have seen with COVID in last 2 years, where the economy tanked massively. And more of this event will happen because of extreme climate change. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of sore throat. At international level, OECD had been in the forefront of supporting public institutions who are applying behavioral insight to improve public policy. Here in India, the Indian civil societies can also work with policymakers to ensure the climate positive behaviors and insights are integrated in Indian policymaking. The rural India is even today living a much higher sustainable livelihood and life practices. It's more the urban India which needs to cope up. But the economic drivers showcase that more and more urbanization is inevitable, and it has happened globally. But when we move into urban infrastructure, that infrastructure also needs to build in a way that the core values of sustainable livelihood and consumption remains ingrained in developmental activities, even in India. With that, I will close my initial remarks, and over to you, sir.
Right. Thank you, Shubhashish, for your excellent presentation. And in fact, you've done very well in pointing to the lifestyle and sustainable consumption practices and examples that we can derived from our indigenous communities. I mean, of course, from the Northeast, but you gave examples from other parts of the country as well. So I think that is something that we need to keep in mind as we move forward. Another important point that you made was that sustainability does not involve or is not likely to involve adverse economic consequences. On the contrary, it may in fact have positive economic consequences, and that's something that most of us would be in agreement with. So our next speaker is Mr. George Cherian. He's Director Cuts International. So Mr. Cherian, you have the floor, and I would request you to keep your remarks to within 7 minutes. So over to you.
Thanks, Dr. Ghosh. Glad to be part of this round table. Due to the paucity of time, I would like to share some thoughts from the consumer perspective on the downstream segment of the resource value chain that includes end consumers and disposals. As all of us know, the SDG 12 is aiming at transforming the current pattern and structure of consumer behavior to a more sustainable one. And sustainable living and lifestyle for the first time it appeared in the SDGs, SDG 4 and 12.8 specifically. And sustainable lifestyle, we all know, is rethinking our ways of living, how we buy and how we organize our everyday life. It is also about altering how we socialize, exchange, share, educate, and build identities. It means transforming our societies and living in harmony with our natural environment. As consumers at home and at work, many of our choices on energy use, transport, food, waste contribute towards building sustainable lifestyle. However, consumers simply do not change behavior and adopt a sustainable lifestyle based on what they are expected to do. They do not respond to data and statistics, nor to negative future scenarios. People act to fulfill their needs and aspirations. They make decisions based on price, accessibility, effectiveness, and additional criteria like well-being or trends. Sustainability is not the defining criteria. We have done several consumer surveys, State of the Indian Consumer Report. The consumers say about 67.5% say BE star rating on energy efficient product is good or eco labeling is good. But when it comes to the purchase of the thing, only the price matters. Even the consumers who want to live more sustainably often lack information and access to affordable and desirable products and services. This underscores that beyond people, it is up to the governments and businesses, who also are consumers, to provide more information and support positive behavior change and to support and develop new business models to make sustainable living a default option. Here I refer to the UN guidelines on consumer protection. The section on sustainable consumption clearly underlined the responsibility of various stakeholders. I quote, responsibility for sustainable consumption is shared by all members and organizations of society with informed consumers, government, businesses, labor organization, and consumer and environmental organization playing particularly important roles. I'm not going into the details of that, but here it is the international instrument available, specifically defining the role of various stakeholders in guiding the consumers towards a sustainable consumption and sustainable lifestyle. Coming to the Indian context, which it was referred in the keynote address as well, India being a critical juncture of transition from developing nation to a global leader, continue to face several inherent challenges in the realm of sustainable consumption and production. In India, traditional practices that are sustainable and environment friendly continue to be a part of people's life. India has a history of a low carbon footprint and lifestyle. These need to be encouraged rather than replaced by more modern but unsustainable practices and technologies. So we need to retain and regain these traditional practices. We, a couple of years back, had done a documentation of case studies on sustainable culture, practices, and lifestyle from different states, regions, and cultures and lifestyles in India. And it was a dedicated effort to bring forth the cases of diverse subjects which have the potential to contribute massively towards sustainable development and push for a more responsible model of circular economy. So one of the solution is looking back to the traditional practices, may not be adopting in the same manner, linking it with modernity and scaling it up. Coming back again to the consumer behavior and lifestyle, definitely we all agree it can contribute towards responsible consumption and influence. It is having a capability to influence the production. However, huge part of global greenhouse emission is linked to private households. The energy, food, and transport sectors each contribute substantially towards lifestyle emission. From the electricity we use to the food we eat, they the way we travel and the things we buy, we can make a difference. Consumers are increasingly concerned about environmental and social and economic issues and increasingly willing to act on those concerns. However, consumer willingness is not translating into sustainable consumer behavior. That is the biggest challenge that we are facing. A variety of barriers have been identified, such as availability, affordability, convenience, product performance, conflicting priorities, skepticism, and force of habit. Here I quote a recent the study done by a consulting firm. It says at least 60% of the consumers in India are willing to pay a premium for sustainability products, while 52% in urban India expect to increase spending on planet-friendly brands in the next 3 years. However, nascent understanding, high price, availability issues, and lack of sustainable options are current challenges influencing the purchase. 43% rank sustainability as a top 5 key purchasing criteria, yet sustainable products comprise only 5% of the market share in the packaged food. Even though the consumers want to opt for sustainable product, it is not available in the market. So it is the responsibility of the businesses to focus more on that. I briefly touch upon some of the policy initiatives. Several country-level policy initiatives such as extended producer responsibility, polluter pays principle have been undertaken in India to transit to a regime of sustainable consumption and production. But the EPR, the plastic management rules of 2016 and e-waste management of 2016, much more need to be done. With a country like India, with just a little more than 1,200 dismantlers or the recyclers, we cannot achieve these target, and the manufacturers fail in the EPR. Recently, the Department of Consumer Affairs announced they develop a comprehensive framework for right to repair. The right to repair refers to government legislation that is intended to allow consumers the ability to repair and modify their own consumer electronic devices, where otherwise the manufacturer or such devices require the consumer to use only their offered services. Just one more thing I want to mention, the eco labeling has emerged all over the world, an effective method to inculcate environmental sensitivity in consumers. In India also, we have adopted the eco mark way back in 1991, but unfortunately, even after the 3 decades, it is a non-starter in India. So there are several related to transport or food. I am not going into the details of this thing. So we are taking, policy initiative, but it needs to be effectively implemented and see that the objectives are achieved by that. Just one more thing. Shelley had spoken about responsible advertisements. Here also it is happening, but it is a matter of serious concern. The greenwashing, the blue washing, and the SDG washing is taking place. Where the businesses use their signboards for marketing their positive contribution to some of these goals, while ignoring or not fully reporting their negative impact on others. It still signals the recognition of the need to address our environmental and social changes. That means we need to help the consumers to buy better, to consume better, and to dispose better. So that much more we need to do it. The responsibility cannot be cannot be only on the consumers, even though there is need for mass awareness. Even the consumer want to, oh, such product should be available, and the policy initiative also has to be to support the change in the consumer behavior. I stop here. Thanks for the opportunity. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. George Chedian, for your very wide-ranging presentation. And actually, if I can pick out, one aspect of your presentation which really stands out, and it is that even if consumers, seek to consume sustainable products, the products are simply not available in the market, and that's something which certainly needs to be addressed. But you have made many other points. It's really not possible for me to summarize them. So our next speaker is Mr. Timon Leopold. He is Deputy Head, Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation, Nuclear Safety and Consumer Protection from Germany. So you have the floor, Mr. Leopold.
Thank you very much, Chair. I hope you can all hear me well. First of all, I would like to recall that earlier this year, in May this year, Chancellor Scholz and Prime Minister Modi agreed to work together on a green and sustainable development partnership. The partnership illustrates our commitment to accelerate the implementation of the SDGs by 2030, as well as climate action, and allows us to intensify concrete cooperation in this area. So I believe that this partnership is also a very good background for today's discussion. The International Resource Panel of the United Nations has found that 90% of global biodiversity loss and water stress and half of global GHG emissions stem from resource extraction and processing. So this shows that this massive environmental footprint is embedded in everything we consume. So I will touch upon a couple of points that have been mentioned already by previous speakers, but they're so central. So I think that it makes sense to really underline where the responsibilities and also the areas of actions lie. So some people say every time we go to a supermarket and buy products, we basically vote. It's almost a political act. It has a big impact. Everything we consume has a massive environmental footprint across the value chain. And with that comes a certain degree of responsibility. So several actors have touched upon this area as well. If we take a quick look at Germany, the use of raw materials has remained stable over the last couple of years, but at a very elevated level compared with the global average. That is especially important because Germany imports a lot of its raw materials, which means it has obviously a considerable environmental footprint across value chains. Now, the good news here is that since German GDP has grown in recent years, but resource use has remained constant, the resource use has, or the GDP has been decoupled, the growth has been decoupled of resource use. So that is positive. Resource productivity, which is an important indicator, has gone up. And obviously, we're interested in continuing this trend. However, the bad news is that's not enough. Resource use and the related environmental footprint is still very high, as has been mentioned a couple of times. Developed countries and G7 countries have a very, very high environmental footprint, and the new government has therefore announced to reduce the absolute use of primary raw materials and develop a circular economy strategy to accomplish that. Now, coming to the perspective of consumers, not all consumers are in the position to make these sustainable choices. Again, this has been touched upon before, but I would like to highlight it again. Often sustainable choices are still much too expensive or burdensome, or often consumers are not even aware of certain sustainable options, which highlights the importance of consumer information. And this is where politics comes in. Obviously, businesses play a role here as well, but I would like to focus on politics, because politics has to provide and has to enable consumers to make sustainable choices by setting the right framework conditions. I will quickly mention a couple of examples from the sectors that were highlighted. Maybe if I may, let me start with one sector that has not been covered so far, but which is very important at the moment in the German debate, which is electronics. So a key question in this sector is repairability. We're very interested in having durable and having repairable products. However, this is not the norm in today's market. It's rather the exception. And normally, electronic devices don't last as long as they could. So they're not repairable. Sometimes there are no spare parts available. And even if they are, they're not accessible because they're too expensive. So the German government would like to introduce a right to repair. And then apparently there are similar plans in India, which is amazing. And that is very important for consumer protection as well. This right to repair has also been included in the new coalition agreement of the new government. So my ministry, the BMUV, is currently coordinating a program of action with other ministries that shall contain measures to make products more repairable and to strengthen consumers by giving them more rights. Measures in there could be on eco-design, procurement of goods, and financial incentives. And we also want to really support and build up the repair sector in Germany. Another important sector, and that has been covered by the TERI studies, is transport. So research by the International Resource Panel, the IRP, and others show there must be a focus on human needs and well-beings, which leads us really to the provision of services. So according to their research, most people need the service, which is in this case mobility, rather than the product, which would be a certain type of means of transport. That means for governments that they should provide well-functioning and accessible public transport. This obviously can be accompanied by certain business models, such as ride sharing. So there are clear business opportunities there as well. And that doesn't mean that individual mobility will go away entirely. Many people will still have the desire to move around independently, which is fine, but the overall system should be changed so that it actually serves all. So this systemic perspective and systemic changes are most effective, but of course there are also individual measures that can make a difference. For example, the type of car, so choosing an electric car if possible, type of materials that go into the production of the car that should be responsibly sourced, and circularity. So the question, how do we get back the materials once the car is cannot be used anymore? Another very important sector is food, again covered by TERI. And here, food loss and waste is a massive problem that needs to be tackled. About 17% of global food production is wasted, and about 30% of agricultural land is used for that part of food production, which is a massive loss, and obviously has a massive biodiversity and climate impact. So that means that all actors need to tackle this issue. Governments, for example, can contribute by raising awareness. There also, again, there are business opportunities, for example, in Germany, but I believe in other countries as well. There are now apps for mobile phones that help businesses to distribute unsold food to customers at a reduced price. And there's also aspects of circularity in there, for example, where waste is inevitably generated, it could be used in other businesses such as fertilizers. Now going to the just quickly to the building sector, or residential sector, I will not go into detail there in the interest of time, but just to highlight, the building sector has been covered by a comprehensive study by the IRP that looked where resource efficiency measures in the building in the residential sector can actually lead to climate protection. So that is a study I highly recommend. If there's an interest in the study, I'm happy to provide the link later on in the chat. Maybe as a last sector, waste management. Here, it's very important to keep the waste hierarchy in mind. So the first step would be that we have to avoid waste altogether. Then we also have to reuse products wherever possible. And then if there is waste, it has to be recycled. So these are the most important steps. The other steps, other recovery and landfilling, should be, if possible, avoided. So the others are to be preferred. For example, in Germany, there has been a ban on landfilling of unsorted municipal waste in 2005, which has massively reduced methane emissions from landfills. Now, governments here must provide adequate framework conditions. That is, for example, collection systems, can be deposit return schemes, which has been a very successful measure in Germany when it comes to beverage packaging. EPR is a very important measure as well. Sorting facilities, processing facilities, this is all very important, but at the same time, and again, information for consumers is absolutely key. When consumers are not aware of the systems that are in place, the systems can't be used adequately. For consumers, that means consumers can avoid not sustainably produced products as long as they are accessible in terms of price and availability. They can avoid products that don't have or that have too much packaging, or use reusable packaging. In Germany, for example, starting next year, all restaurants or shops that provide takeaway food must also provide reusable packaging. So that is a new law introduced in Germany, which we hope will have a good impact as well. And then, in general, consumers can be quite conscious about their consumption in general. Maybe just as a very final point, I would like to highlight where, because that is, I think, also a very important topic of this conversation, where India maybe could have a leading role, and where Germany and India could work together. So as you may be aware, Germany has the G7 presidency at the moment. And this topic that we're talking about today, sustainable lifestyles, resource use, and sustainable consumption and production, we've made this actually a core topic of our presidency this year. And we have done so in the past as well, also on G20 level. So we're more than interested in working together on this topic. Earlier this year, the G7 under our presidency have adopted the Berlin Roadmap on resource efficiency and circular economy, which also includes the necessity to have a good cooperation between the G7 and the G20. So the G7 countries already agreed that this is a core element of their work, and we very much hope that this can be continued under the Indian G20 presidency next year. In our view, but we're very curious to learn about the plans, in our view, the G20 Resource Efficiency Dialogue would be an ideal forum to continue this conversation. And we're very much looking forward to that, because we see that India seems to be well placed to have a leadership role with its tradition of ecological awareness. So thank you very much. And with that, back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Leopold, for your very wide-ranging presentation. And I think it's especially interesting to note that Germany has delinked its natural resource use from GDP growth. I hope that has come about through greater efficiency in use and not by actually, exporting the natural resource use to other countries. But there is your second point, and that is that the question of sustainability, sustainable lifestyles is being pursued under Germany's presidency in the G7, as of course also it will be under the Indian presidency G20, and the possibility of synergies, is very important. Though I hope in reaping these synergies, we don't lose out on the somewhat different perspectives that developing countries who are members of the G20 can bring to the table, and they cannot do that in the G7. So I hope it results in diverse opinions, diverse views coming on the table, diverse examples of sustainable practices, and that both the forums can in fact interact and learn from each other. So thank you very much indeed. And our next speaker is Mr. Vivek Tejasvi. He is Deputy Director of the Asian Development Research Institute. So Mr. Tejasvi, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh, for giving me this opportunity to share my views. As already almost every speaker has mentioned a broader aspect of sustainable lifestyle for consumption and living. So there is not much left for us. But however, I would just like to highlight a couple of my observations from the state, which is not as developed as other states in India. That I see there is a huge role of messaging which we are trying to spread across the sustainability plays a huge role. So this comes from the state government first, and then the industry and the producers. So state, why I'm talking about is because when we talked about the movement of giving the example of LPG, it was very organic to spread message that there are supporting mechanism to the LPG, and consumption will definitely reduce the emission, and that's how the connections and the adoption played a huge role. And on the moment the prices were very much hiked, the consumption or the adoption of the LPG has drastically reduced in the masses. Like for example, in the rural setting where the alternatives are always available for the cooking and heating purpose. So the point is how the state is trying to convey their message of adoption first, and then trying to look upon first aspect is the pricing, where it plays a huge role for the masses who cannot afford considering the luxury of the sustainable items, suppose in the food segment and in the mobility section. In also our scrapping policy, where we are talking more about the scrappage of the older vehicles, we are very less talking about the retrofitting of the technology which are existing. You just need to introduce certain technology by putting little amount and then you can also reduce your waste production. So these kind of messaging also play a huge role, and that need to be focused on the top. And the pricing, I will not take too much time for explaining the same thing which already other esteemed guests has already shared about. Over to you, Dr. Ghosh.
Thank you, Mr. Tejasvi. That was a very brief but cogent statement. So thank you very much indeed. Our next speaker is Dr. Vibhu Prasad Naik. He is Associate Professor at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. So, Professor Naik, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. I would like to thank the organizers for organizing such an interesting event, and also for giving me the opportunity to speak here. Several of our speakers have flagged this idea of Indian way of life, traditional knowledge, lifestyles, and the fact that we are talking about these, I mean, Indian way of life, traditional knowledge and lifestyle is an achievement by itself. And we are talking this in the context of climate change and sustainable development. And of course, a lot of work has been done in this regard, as like one of our speaker was talking about this, and the country has also made significant progress in some of the areas, be it the solar alliance and so we have shown some initial potential to lead the world, like which our leaders often term them as Vishwa Guru and all that. However, let me be the devil's advocate here concerning this idea of Indian way of life. It's certainly a great idea that we are talking about, but how close are we to that in reality? As one of our participants here in the chat box had said, are we hiding behind our masses of the poor? I think that's something probably we need to ask ourselves. And for that, we also need to recognize the conflict that we have between aspirations. When I say aspirations, I mean the consumption aspirations, right? Because consumption like itself is considered as an indicator of prosperity or like economic well-being in general. So are we recognizing the conflict between this consumption aspirations as one moves up in this income mobility and this frugal consumption that Indian way of life that we have been talking about? Are we doing enough to address this conflict that's there? Like, I mean, if you I don't think we have enough macro data to talk about this. Like, for instance, as one move ups in the income level, the mode of transport that we use becomes more and more energy intensive, and that's something which is similarly, like, I mean, that's at the individual level, at micro household level. Similarly, at like bit larger level, as we see our cities are expanding, right? Our resource intensiveness of the cities is on rise. Like, I mean, most of the cities now, those they're growing are getting water from like hundreds of kilometers. I mean, though several of the cities also have lots of local water resources, which are not really are for many different regions, they are not suitable for consumption. So is it something that we should also think about when we are talking about these indexes of sustainable consumption and production? I think like we need to identify like the first is recognize the potential conflict between the aspirations and this like what sustainable lifestyle or consumption that we are talking about. The other is also recognizing the policy inconsistencies, right? So like often the way we are measuring these indexes are looking at whether how sustainable is the procurement policies of the government, but there are many other policies where we have like which promotes maybe like what we can consider as unsustainable consumption. Like, it's a different matter that I don't think the understanding about what is wasteful consumption is very clear. I often like in the classroom when students ask me, I struggle to explain what is wasteful consumption. That's a different matter. I won't get into that. But like in terms of some of the policy inconsistencies, sorry, that we have. Like, for instance, we have a public housing scheme like which was earlier called Indira Awas Yojana, now Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana. That mostly the technology or the material that we use, like often sourced, not really, like, I mean, we do not promote the local the use of local construction material or local construction technologies. And this is something that I think we have been talking about it since, at least I have been hearing this since my, like, I mean, at least 10-12 days, but nothing much has been done. Like, I mean, even in the, like, I mean, higher Himalayas, people do prefer constructing houses by using the materials that's being transported from very far away places. So, and also some of the subsidies that we have, like, I mean, subsidies for the fertilizer, the chemical fertilizer versus the kind of support that the organic fertilizer or, like, I mean, the alternative systems promote, or like the whole idea of centralized waste management and decentralized waste management for a large number of people, particularly people who live in small towns or in the villages. Like, I mean, non-notified towns, the dominant form of waste management has been decentralized. But does that figure anything in terms of our policies as we talk about the sustainable management ideas? And of course, yes, like, I mean, we need like radical changes. We need mass movements to shift towards these, like what we are calling these are sustainable consumption. But then it also depends what kind of information strategy or what kind of outreach strategy that we are having. Only by like mirroring, identifying or saying certain consumption pattern as unsustainable, or using these ideas of wasteful may not, like, I mean, it may take years, for instance, for these ideas to trickle down to these to the masses. And as the masses, for instance, will, as they move up in the income mobility, then the problem could be won't be manageable. And this whole idea of sharing economy and circular economy that we are talking about, are we doing anything about this communitarian life that for instance the rural parts, I think like one of our speakers was talking about, that people had, where the dominant norm was sharing the infrastructure, the private assets with others, like whenever they have any celebrations. We are very first moving away from similar informal institutions or the communitarian lives that has been practiced. So like while we're talking about this Indian way of life, frugal consumption pattern, we also need to have a reality check in terms of like what's there in the ground, or like recognizing the conflicts that it has on the kind of policies that we pursue, and also the kind of aspirations that people have. I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Vibhu Prasad Naik, and I think you adverted to two important things. One is the potential conflicts, that arise between per capita income growth and sustainability, sustainable consumption, and the second about inconsistent policies. And I think these are both very important issues. On the question of the first question that you raised about the potential conflict between per capita income increase and sustainable consumption, I think there's a mixed picture, because if you look at the Indian middle class, it is true that they will move from buses to two-wheelers, and then from two-wheelers to four-wheelers as their per capita income increases. But at the same time, certain sustainable behaviors do not change much. For example, the proportion of meat in that diet does not change very much with many communities. For example, and even some of the very well-to-do people in India still have a bath with a single bucket of water. I'm sure you do that. I certainly do that. Similarly, that every Indian household, there's this informal recycling system, the Kabadiwala. It's a peculiarly Indian institution by which the materials, even if the household doesn't segregate them, the Kabadiwala segregates them, and he pays the households, and whatever is recyclable, whatever is reusable is actually recovered through this system. So these are aspects which do not change, but certainly some things do change. Also, the consciousness about switching off lights, switching off fans, switching off air conditioners when one is not in the room, this is very deeply ingrained. There used to be an advertisement some time ago about one of the newly minted Indian billionaires, that there's a salesman trying to sell him a yacht. And the billionaire just asks one question: how many miles to the gallon does it give? So that was reflective actually of a certain mindset that, look, people are very, very much concerned about their footprint in terms of the environment. So there are certain aspects which change, certain aspects which don't change. Your observations about policy conflicts are certainly very well taken, and you've given a very good example about the PM Awas Yojana. And I think the practice of policy EIAs should be mainstreamed in India. At this point in time, we don't have that much expertise. We have, as it is, we are stretched in undertaking project level, in developing project level EIAs. It will be a while before we can get to the policy level EIAs, but we will get there eventually, and then gradually I think these conflicts will be overcome. So our final speaker in this roundtable is Mr. Mohak Gupta. He is Program Officer, Development Alternatives. So Mr. Gupta, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ghosh, and thank you, TERI, for having me as part of this discussion. It has been a fascinating talk so far. And one of the perils of going at the end is, of course, that a lot of points have already been said and discussed, so I'll try to keep myself concise. I do want to start with the discussion we've been having about the where to focus energies on in terms of urban areas and rural areas. And we do realize that considering the mass of populations we have in rural India right now and their projected urbanization trends and trajectories, so that's also enough of a big enough target population to cater to. And in terms of looking at their traditional lifestyles and how they relate to the environment today, those need to be looked at closely. And it is also important to realize that the way, previous speakers have also said that there is an aspirational gap there in terms of the lifestyle choices that they make. I think it is very important to look at this from a sectoral deep dive perspective. There are certain spaces where that decision making holds a lot more impact. I want to take up the example of the housing sector, where like Mr. Naik also just told us in his speech before. How there is a policy mismatch in terms of what the PMAY scheme is promoting, but also there is what people in the villages are also seeing on their screens and where they are getting their examples and references from. So in effect, besides the policy problem, it also becomes a behavior change communication problem, especially in such sectors where since a lot of construction is yet to happen, so you run the risk of locking in carbon intensive practices. And especially in the housing sector, now we see that there is a lot of focus on the operational energy aspects of buildings, but a major contribution to those decisions can also come from the embodied energy space, which are not adequately addressed yet in policy or even in certification systems. So therein also lies the problem of the data gap and also providing credible information, because we do understand that a lot of the certification and eco-labeling systems that we work with right now are sort of limited, sometimes by not adopting a complete cradle to cradle approach, not looking at the life cycle impacts of it. So in those terms, it is very necessary to strengthen and make those certification systems robust, because that is what the end user is often grappling with. Those are the kind of standards that they look for. And therein, I would like to also bring in a point about trust. Looking at it from the consumer behavior perspective, it is very important for consumers to be able to trust the information that they get, wherein it becomes important for governments also to be able to provide credible data and build that kind of energy and momentum for these systems to really take place. But that's only going to happen when consumers are able to trust the information they're getting. And there, in fact, from the market perspective, brands have a very strong role to play in terms of demonstrating whatever sustainability strategies they might be projecting, but actually putting them on ground. And in that respect, in fact, when we see examples like of the Patagonia chairman giving away their company as a towards sustainability, so those are also examples where brands can like that helps for brands to build brand loyalty with the consumers, but also for such people to become beacons of hope and become those leaders that people can look up to for inspiration, which can often have a very strong impact in their own decision making. Similarly, within communities, it's on the topic of trust itself, there is also important to have that kind of conversation and trust building within the community, because a lot of our decision making is derived from that. And even when we talk about things like, again, going back to the housing example, for a lot of India, where the construction sector might be informal and probably not everyone is hiring an architect to design buildings. So in their case, the choice of materials might be coming from sources like the local masons. So in that respect, who is it that is providing information? Where is that coming from? Those kind of mechanisms really, I would say, need to be strengthened, and that aspect of trust would need to be highlighted and made more robust. One more point that I would like to make is about when we're talking about linking science to policy and bringing it to action, and also to address data gaps that exist right now, I think one of the things to look at would be ideas of citizen science and how that gets citizens involved in the conversation, in the data collection, but more importantly, I think it also allows citizens to feel a sense of agency in terms of affecting change. As long as they are very dissociated from the problem, there is very little they can do to address it. But being involved in the process, I think it lends a sense of agency for them to actually feel like they have a say in the decision-making process. So that works as a data collection mechanism, also as a means of building trust and that conversation within the communities. Uh, that being said, I think I would like to just finish with one point, and that is in terms of India's role as in terms of leading the activities for G20. So I would say that this is probably the perfect opportunity for the country to actually demonstrate all that we have been talking about. So through the 1 year of activities that we engage in, demonstrating those sustainable consumption and production decisions and practices, I think would be very essential. So I think with that, I will hand over back to you, Dr. Ghosh.
Thank you, Mr. Gupta, for this very interesting presentation. And I think, your points about corporates assuming leadership roles for sustainability of their products is a very important issue. And I think also the point that you made about what the sources of information are with respect to consumer choices, with respect to choice of materials, what you mentioned about the mason being the one who advises the consumer about materials. This is again a very important point. And this brings me, well, while we have finished with our speakers and we have a little time left, so maybe we can spend a little time discussing how to affect behavioral change in consumers, and in particular the role of social media in nudging consumers to adopt sustainable lifestyles and providing them information. And you see, the social media has become ubiquitous throughout the world, and a great deal of the information which was earlier coming to people from newspapers, from formal media outlets, this is now coming through social media, and a great deal of disinformation is also coming through social media. A great deal of perverse lifestyle examples are being pervaded through social media. But then social media is a neutral medium, in the sense that if it is to be used, it can potentially be used to promote unsustainable choices as well as sustainable choices. So can I invite our participants in the round table if they have any thoughts on the role of social media in nudging sustainable lifestyles?
I can start with pleasure. And there is a very interesting insight that we have seen, and I think we've heard it in the conversation today. The first one, it is the importance of working with the industry that guides a lot of the consumption patterns. And this is not only the social media, it is at the end the industry that's promoting unsustainable lifestyles. So it is very much the companies that are guiding and producing the research that is used for publicity campaigns, that it is guiding what member states or individuals.
You are not audible anymore, Mr. Seris.
Guiding publicity campaigns, and the marketing firms are critical, but also individual lifestyles influencers that carry a lot of weight and responsibility to lead by example. And this is important as to promote a spirit of frugality, as it being something that wants to be emulated, and second, to see this as a desirable lifestyle choice. So this is what I wanted to show, and I wanted to share, because it represents a bit this approach for a more circular business model, and it's what I have heard in the discussions today.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Sellis, for your insights. And any other members of the roundtable, would they like to come in on this?
Yes, if I may, Chair, if it's okay, I would like to follow up on what Jorge just said. Basically, underlining the importance because companies, as we've all outlined before, obviously they have a special responsibility. For example, when it comes to food consumption. And we've also mentioned earlier, one speaker mentioned the issue of greenwashing and false green claims, which is an issue that in Europe, for example, we are very closely looking at that at the moment. And then social media, including also influencers, for example, obviously they have a role to play in how these messages get disseminated. So at the same time, we also have positive examples of influencers, of companies that really aim to act responsibly and spread their messages using social media. But for consumers, it can be hard sometimes to differentiate which claims are false green claims and which can be trusted. I think that was also something that our last speaker mentioned, that trust is a very important aspect in consumer choices, and I absolutely agree. And this is exactly where also governments can provide some guidance by tackling false green claims. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Leopold. Any other of the participants?
Yeah, and I'm George here. While discussing, we have seen that lack of information about sustainable products is one of the main constraints that the consumers are facing. So I think in this information dissemination, the social media can play a big role in informing the consumers about the sustainability of the products and helping them in changing the lifestyle or the consumer behavior. But at the same time, in a country like India, when we are talking about social media, we have to keep in mind, not that maybe the middle class or the other, up to certain extent, the social media like Twitter or Instagram, the only thing which reach out to the masses in the rural area, it is only the WhatsApp. So that the choice of the social media also in the dissemination of such information, which is the constituency of the people or the category of the people, that consumers that we are targeting, and accordingly we need to choose the appropriate social media in the dissemination of this information. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Cherian. The only problem that I see about I'll come to WhatsApp is that one gets so many messages which are essentially trash on WhatsApp that there's a credibility issue about about this particular medium. Maybe we can look back at a hugely successful global campaign which happened some decades ago, but actually transformed people's perceptions and habits. And I'm referring to smoking, because when I was a young man, it was the cool thing to smoke. But then there were scientific findings, there were medical findings. These were communicated very effectively through the media at that time, which did not include what we now know as social media, but it had the effect of actually completely delegitimizing smoking. So I know very, very few people now who smoke at all, and they would certainly not smoke in the office or in the presence of other people. So, for example, in a gathering, if somebody wants to smoke, he or she steps out of the room into the open and lights up. And so this was a hugely successful campaign. I do not know that it was particularly well coordinated. Certainly, there were perverse, drivers trying to delegitimize the campaign, the tobacco companies and so on. But nevertheless, it worked. So maybe there are lessons that we can draw from how the whole question of smoking was delegitimized. Okay, so now I think Mr. Tejasvi would like to come in. Yeah, Dr. Naik, I think.
Yeah.
Dr. Naik would like to come in.
Yes, thank you, sir. Yeah, so yes, social media can do play a role, but we need to recognize how information works. Like, I mean, as you have the example that you had given about the smoking. See, we get lots of information every day, but how much of information that we actually use in our day-to-day life, forget about bringing changes into our lifestyle. I think that is important. We need to like find effective ways of communicating that can actually work, and we have many examples. One example that I had given was the smoking. The other example that we often talk about in the disaster management discourses, like for instance in Odisha, this whole idea of early warning system for the cyclone, concerning cyclone for the relocation. So, like, I mean, even in 99 cyclone where like thousands of people died, government did pass this information to the people. Announcements were made to move to the safe place. But this whole idea of what is safe place was something which was not very clear. So over the years, government has worked on this idea. They gave them an alternative space which was called safe. So these days in Odisha, for instance, whenever there is a flood or cyclone, the shelters are not, people not just asked to move to the shelter, but also shelters are provided with cook food, generator sets with electricity and mobile charging facilities. So that is something which works as an incentive, and also there is lots of mobilization that happens at the ground level. The Panchayat Raj representatives, they also get into action, the officials. So I think how the information will be used by the people to bring a change is something is very important. We need to understand that dynamics. The other example is these sea cowards. The number of cowards are on rise, and also the kind of merchandise they use now. Like there is a significant change in 10 years, and there is no scheme, for instance, to promote those kind of things, but that moves. So probably, like, I think I find that as a very effective, powerful communication medium. So we need to identify what kind of communication will work, and then probably invest on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent examples there, Dr. Naik. Anyone else would like to come in?
Yes, sir, with your permission. So we have talked significantly about social media and influencer. I guess one group of influencer which I believe we missed out on are the cultural slash religious gurus. We have seen the kind of impact someone like Ramdev Baba or Brahma Kumaris have on the lifestyle of people following their sermons. We have also had the example of Anna Hazare, who is not coming from the religious background, but also without having a lot of influence on social media, or he could actually mobilize a large mass within the country for a common cause. So these are also tools and techniques we should utilize going forward. And these are, I believe, tools and techniques which are also closer to the common masses, not only the urban middle class.
Yeah, I think this is an excellent example. In my own experience, when I was in the Ministry of Environment and Forests, a new technology for cremation of bodies was developed, which would use much less wood. Many Indians, they cremate their loved ones when they pass away, and traditionally that process involved the consumption of a great deal of wood. And so a new technology was developed by which the quantum of wood was actually reduced by an order of magnitude. But people were reluctant to use this technique because it was not traditional, and they were not very sure that as to whether it had religious sanction. So we enlisted the heads of some religious bodies to spread the message that this was perfectly legitimate in religious terms. And I think that that messaging worked, and this technology has has taken off in a big way, and this technology is actually available as an option in almost all the metro crematoriums that we see in our country. Another example was given by our honorable Prime Minister in an address which I was present. And what he said is that when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, he interacted with the priests of temples, and in the Indian tradition, when somebody goes to a temple, one gives an offering to the deity, and the priest in turn gives some flowers or some fruit to the worshipper. And so the practice that he adopted was that the priests would give a sapling of a fruit tree to the worshipper, and then instruct him that the next time you come here for your pilgrimage, you get for the deity fruit from this tree. And this practice led to a huge increase in tree planting in Gujarat, which is a rather arid state. So these are examples of the same nature that that you just mentioned. So I think that if we have no more participants of this question, so maybe we would like to invite another question, and that is, what was actually addressed by by Dr. Naik, and that is that when people reach middle class status or higher, that they tend to adopt some practices which are unsustainable. So how can we ensure what kind of norms, what kind of policies can be, what kind of corporate strategies can be adopted to ensure that when people reach middle class status, they don't give up, the sustainable ways, that they followed hitherto, even though their consumption may increase. So can I have some inputs on that?
Just quick reactions. We have been working on a very interesting campaign that it's linked to the policy paper that was presented at the beginning of this session that speaks about 5 actions. So the first one, it is very much from a personal perspective, thinking about diets. So diets that draw from different sources of protein. This is, of course, an element of income, but it's also an element of culture. If we improve the way governments purchase food, that it's put on canteens and that it's put on schools, you are already creating an environment in which people will grow with an affection and an attraction to plant-based diets. India can lead the way on that. The second one, it is by thinking on the way we travel and spend our leisure and move. Of course, by having this culture of using non-motorized vehicles for transport, that is, we are seeing it in developed countries, and infrastructure needs to be improved so that developing countries is a safe, affordable, but also interesting alternative that provides healthy benefits to you, improving public transport. So the way you move, it does not needs to be associated to your income level. There's a lot of governments, a lot of things that governments can do. Those are just 2 things. And the third one, it is, do we need to rethink the way we live and associate lavish expenditure with big houses, when as a matter of fact what we are seeing, it is that it's perfectly desirable to aspire to have a I would say humane sized house that allows you better to take advantage of the city, to take advantage of activities that are out there, and not necessarily associate that with a number of square meters, right? So I think these are 3 very simple things that can be done, that involve policy editing, that involve partnerships, that involve aspirational approaches, that can be absolutely linked to the LIFE campaign and can be understood at a global scale.
Yeah, that's a very important point. I think the key is that sustainability practices should count as signaling, one's enhanced social status. That is, when one becomes richer, one becomes better off. Rather than buying a bigger car, you buy a bicycle, and that you associate buying the bicycle and using that bicycle with the fact that you have now reached a certain elevated status in life. And I think that these are nudges which can change behaviors, or at least ensure that people don't drastically change their lifestyles as they become richer. So would anyone else like to comment on this?
If I can, yeah, Dr. Ghosh, if I could make a point. Yeah, there is actually a strange conundrum here because on the one hand we're talking about how consumer choices change with rising incomes, but at the same time there is also the idea of sustainable products being more expensive, or definitely a perception being there in the market of sustainable products being more expensive as compared to regular products, which is especially true for the food markets. We see organic produce is often priced higher and so on. So in that respect, it is also at the same time a question of whether you incentivize sustainable products so that they are cheaper, or whether the pricing mechanisms for other products are revised to showcase, to portray their true environmental costs as well. But in either of those cases, I think the affordability factor and sustainability are linked in that other way as well. So just wanted to bring that up.
Well, you have actually touched upon a very economist way of thinking that makes sustainable products cheaper, and then people would be induced to take them up. But there is also the economic concept of Veblen goods. That is, you consume things. The demand for certain things increases simply because they are cheap, because they are more expensive. So maybe organic foods, they are more expensive, but that might provide a pathway to them being adopted by the better off in society, and thereby signaling their status to the others. And the fact of consumption of sustainable foods is a lifestyle choice to be aspired for, rather than rejected as one becomes richer. So there are many ways of looking at this particular problem, but certainly I think that the question of modifying consumer behavior to ensure that people retain their sustainable choices as they become better off is certainly a very big policy and societal challenge. So I think we will close the roundtable discussion at this point, and I invite Dr. Sunil Pandey, he's Director TERI, to give his summing up and concluding remarks. Dr. Pandey, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ghosh, and I would also like to thank all the panelists for providing the remarks on the background paper, which we did, and suggestions around that. We started initially with address from Mr. Amitabh Kant on India's focus on accelerating clean energy demands and investing in clean energy, and also he suggested that we should focus on responsibilities to bring in change at the individual level, and which is as per lifestyles for the environment, which was propagated to Honorable Prime Minister earlier. And the key takeaways from our address from the Niti Aayog, Ms. Kochhar focused on need for behavioral change and various tools which can bring in behavioral change, and how behavioral change also needs to be scaled up, basically to generate and also need to generate data on how behavioral change happens and how much behavioral change happens in a quantified manner. Dr. Ghosh also in a nice way actually summarized all the key remarks of all the panelists, and while summarizing that, he also indicated that as said earlier by Ms. Kochhar, that adaptation behavior in addition to mitigation behavior, change in adaptation behavior also needs to be explored. And finally, I mean, the key points as a takeaway points for us to consider in the note, which we will certainly refine based on discussions which we had now, is basically the one point that increasing per capita income need not necessarily mean that consumption has to be increased. And the countries who have demonstrated that, there was example from Germany, there are examples from other countries as well on essentially decoupling economic growth and with the resource consumption, and also in certain cases from the waste generation. There's also a suggestion that traditional conservation practices need to be documented and need to be practiced more widespread, so that because there is inbuilt conservation in these conservation practices, and they are lean on resource use. Interesting suggestion also was that sustainability, practicing sustainability need not have negative economic impact. So economic growth can be pursued in a sustainable manner as well. And basically to reach out to individuals on doing so, civic society, civic actors and society has a role in influencing behavior. And there was also a suggestion on certain barriers for opting for sustainable products and how these barriers need to be addressed for adoption of products which are more sustainable compared to products which are less sustainable. And there were some tools discussed. Key tools of that, those are how EPR needs to be, extended producer responsibility needs to be designed and targeted in a manner that they promote sustainable consumption and sustainable production relating to which can result into products which are more environmentally benign. And right to repair also as a tool was discussed, and many countries, I'm sure, are discussing this as a policy instrument, basically to enhance the life of the products which currently, especially in IT space, are very short-lived and are discarded, even if they are fully functional, are discarded because of lack of certain minor components or software. And other key issue which was also mentioned as one of the problems which indicates which is a barrier to sustainable consumption and production is a huge food loss which is occurring globally. And it was indicated that around 70% of food is wasted because of largely because of unsustainable consumption and unsustainable procurement and consumption. And this is kind of sad in terms of which was also pointed out by one of the panelists, that there's a huge population which is still unserved in developing and underdeveloped economies, and which also need to basically be provided with resources. So such losses are not certainly not acceptable. Among the barriers, also what was also indicated was that as the aspirations grow and resource consumption grows, especially for the in Indian context, the growing middle class, that would certainly will be constrained for sustainable consumption and production. There's also indication on realigning policies which are conflicting in nature, which in order to promote a sustainable consumption. And as a stakeholder, apart from influencing individual behavior, engaging them also as an important stakeholders in decision making, and making them understand that they are important in influencing behavior in sustainable consumption and production. And in the last, there was also a discussion on what should be the role of different media, including social media, in nudging the behavior change. So these were some of the key points which were emerging out of the discussion. And I'll close my remarks on the points which we discussed as a concluding summary. I'm sorry if I have missed out on something. In the end, as my duty to propose vote of thanks, I'll like to first start with our supporter for this initiative, Bloomberg Philanthropies, the Rockefeller Foundation, PMUB Ministry from Germany, IKI Foundation, IKI and Tata Capitals, and also thank our keynote addressee, Mr. Amitabh Kant, our presenter from Niti Aayog, Ms. Chelsea Kocher, Dr. Ghosh from TERI, who very skillfully handled the session and chaired the session and provided also insight which helped me summarizing the discussion. And also Shally and her team at WSDS Secretariat for, and also the program cell at TERI for coordinating the event. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you, sir. Thank you everyone for such an insightful discussion. Thank you everyone for joining.